Now, the fourth and last movement of this text, and I'm going to get on out of here, is verses 11 and 12. And it tells us, when hate won't leave you alone, testify. And that's how they do it in the Sanctified Church. They testify. Now, I can use spiritual imagination. I can imagine David coming up to the mic. And David do the old school testimony. David would say a little something like this. He said, first, giving honor to my Yahweh, who is the head of my life, giving honor to the pastor, church leaders, membership, and friends, because you know how we do it. I want to testify about the goodness of God. And David just does not give a simple testimony. David gives a three-part testimony in this verse. He testifies of God's power. David testifies of God's love. And David testifies of God's reward. He testifies of God's power when he says that God has spoken once. Twice I have heard this. Now, David uses what is called this Hebrew idiom. And in this Hebrew idiom, it's used in the sense to let people know that what I'm about to say is not just theory. He says, I've heard this thing twice. That God has spoken, I heard it twice. And it's a Hebrew idiom that I have experienced what I'm about to tell you. And because I have experienced what I'm about to tell you, I can testify about it. And he says, God, all power belongs to God. All power belongs to God. And then he says, I want to testify about God's love. And he says that also to you, O Lord, belongs mercy. And that Hebrew word mercy is the word hesed, which essentially means steadfast, unfailing love of God. And David says, I'm going to testify to you about the love of God, because David understood that he had messed up many times. But yet and still, God has shown him mercy, and God has shown him love. And when I thought about that, when I thought about the mercy and the unfailing love and unconditional love of God, I thought about my mom. I thought about my mother. And I thought about this story that when I was a young lad, I grew up in the country, by the way, and we would go to these old-time country revivals. Y'all know how it is. And it was one hot Sunday in July. And we went to this revival, and the parking lot of the church was crowded. So by the time we got there, we had to park along the side of the road. Now, being a young lad, as I stepped out of the car, and you know, by the way, mothers know, for somehow, I don't know how they know this, but mothers know what the children often think. So I stepped out of the car, and I saw this beautiful ant bed. And my mother looked at me and said, boy, don't you mess with that ant bed. And my mother grabs my hand, and we walk across the road to the church. And as she grabbed my hand, I'm looking back at that ant bed. I'm looking back, thinking about that ant bed. And we're sitting in the church, and this was old school church, by the way, so the deacons were leading devotion. So as the deacons led devotions, I'm sitting next to my mom. I'm sitting there thinking about, man, you know what? That was a big old ant bed. And as the deacons began to pray, and they came around and they had the thing out on the little kneeling bench, and they were praying, saying the Lord's Prayer. And I was thinking, man, you know, that was a big old red ant bed. I wonder what they're doing in. And as the preacher began to preach, I'm sitting next to my mom, and I'm thinking, I'm wondering how many ants are in that ant bed. And then service is over, and some people come over and talk to my mom, and then I see that as an opportunity to continue my exploration. And as my mother turns and talks, guess what I do? I shoot out the back of the church, head toward the ant bed, and I'm there. And I begin to stare at that ant bed. And I'm gazing, I'm like, finally, we are alone together. And I look at that ant bed, and I'm thinking about how many ants are in that ant bed, and for some impulsive reason, I do this. I kick the ant bed, and red dirt comes all over my head, and I'm covered in ants. And you know who I ran to? My mama. I shot across the road, headed toward my mama, and when she saw me coming, she knew exactly what had happened. I ran to my mother. She didn't say a word. She took me, dusted me off, got all the ants off me. And she said this, now go over there and sit down until it's time to go. But you know what? That's exactly how God's mercy and unfailing love is toward us. See, we often do stuff that we're not supposed to do, but here we come running back to God. And you know what? It is not a surprise to God because he already knew we did, but we come running back to God. And God just wants to teach us. God just wants to protect us. And we come running back to God and he says, come on over here. Let me cover you with forgiveness. Let me cover you with my grace. Let me wrap you in my mercy so that I can use you for my glory. I want to tell you, church, that just like my mother took care of me, God takes care of you. And he's reminding you that you need to testify about the goodness of God and all that he's done for you, and remind you that hate won't leave you alone. You need to testify about all the good things that God has done for you. And the last movement of this text, he says that when hate won't leave you alone, I'm going to testify about God's reward. Now, this idea of reward is not a reward in relationship to you earning your salvation, because we know by grace we have been saved through faith, that it's a gift of God, not works. So it's not talking about works of salvation. What this is talking about for the believer is the fact that after we have accepted Jesus Christ, there are certain level of rewards that we receive. There are things that we receive on this earth and God's blessings, but there are things that God has promised us in heaven that we get. And it talks about these crowns of righteousness. Now, theologians have postulated what these are, and nobody really knows exactly what they are, but what we do know that there are varying degrees of rewards and crowns in heaven. But to the unbeliever, it's a whole nother thing. To the enemies, it means a whole nother thing. He says, and God will render to each one according to his work. In other words, David is saying, the enemy is going to reap what they sow. And when I thought about this reaping a sowing, I thought about one of the most famous TV shows in the 80s. You guys are familiar with Dallas. TV show Dallas? And one of the main central characters was this guy called J.R. Ewing. Now, J.R. Ewing was many people's enemies, and he had a lot of enemies, and he was enemies to other people. Now, one of the things about J.R., he didn't care who he plotted and planned against. He would plan against his wife. He planned against his brother. He planned against his mama. He planned against his daddy. If he wanted you out of the way, he was going to plan how to get rid of you. And one of the things that a signature J.R. Ewing move, if he wanted to get rid of you, y'all might remember this. He would call you in his office at night, and he says, how you doing tonight? And then while he's talking, he slowly pulled open this drawer. And in this drawer was a file with your name on it. Because what J.R. had done, and he had hired a private investigator to pull up all the dirt that he knew of you. He picked that file open in his desk and said, hey there, bud, I wonder, does your wife know the lady that you meeting every Tuesday at the hotel? And does your husband know about that bank account where you was putting money away? Because he had a file that he was using against you. But something happened. I believe it was, I don't know what, maybe 1980, where the most watched episode of Dallas occurred, where 350 million people came. And the title was, Who Shot JR? Because on that day, Who Shot JR was his day of reckoning. JR on that day reaped what he sowed. He had plotted and planned and schemed and went against many people. But on that day was a day of reckoning. God is reminding you, and David is reminding you, that you're going to testify about God's rewards, because you understand that it might look good for the enemy now, but a day of reckoning is coming. And if you just wait and you trust and you abide in God, then God is going to take care of your enemy. So when hate won't leave you alone, you have your own testimony service. Now, you remember the songs that we talked about earlier, where there was a wide range of emotions, where James Brown was saying, I'm going to pay him back for taking my woman, for stealing my money and taking my honey. Where Jasmine Sullivan was talking about, I'm going to bust the windows out your car. But then Fred Hammond, you remember we talked about it, what did he say? He said, no weapon formed against me shall prosper. Now, what we need to do is get to the point where that can become our testimony, our song, that when hate won't leave us alone, we can continue the rest of that song. And can I tell you what it says? It says this: God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word, and he will come through. God will do what he said he would do. He will stand by his word, and he will come through. Oh, I won't be afraid of the arrows by day from the hand of my enemy. I can stand my ground with the Lord on my side, for the snares they have set will not succeed. No weapon formed against you shall prosper.